Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edgar Jatsu, and I'm the Executive Director for Workplace Fairness. And I want to welcome you all to our webinar, Updates You Need to Know About Employment and Immigration Law. And today we'll discuss where we stand with how immigration law has impacted migrant workers, the legacy of the Trump administration's immigration policies, and what to expect with the Biden administration. And I'd like our panelist, Jonathan Grode, to introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Grode. I'm the managing partner of Green and Spiegel. We're an immigration firm in the United States, headquartered in Philadelphia. I teach a little bit, Edgar, as an adjunct professor at Temple Law, and I'm a proud member of the ABA Labor and Employment Law section, where I help run their immigration committee. And frankly, I'm just happy to be here with you today to wrap a little bit about what's going on in the world of immigration and workers' rights and just, dealing with the pandemic and how it relates to immigration policy. So, thanks for having me. And hopefully we can get some good insights for the audience and take it from there.
Thank you, Jonathan, so much. And very quickly, Workplace Fairness is a 501c3 organization, nonprofit, located in D.C., and our mission in a nutshell is to educate the public on workers' rights around the country and under federal law. And today, any viewpoints expressed are not to be taken as legal advice. It's for information purposes only. So, Jonathan, a lot has happened this year and past 4 years when it comes to immigration, how it has impacted employment law. So, to start things off, why don't you give us an explanation as to where things are today in light of COVID-19 and in this current administration?
I'd be happy to, Edgar. I mean, I think, it's a question that almost begs us to go back a little bit further in time in some ways, because I think a lot of people associate the way the Trump administration has been handling immigration as something that's akin to the way the Republican Party has always treated immigration. And that's not true. I mean, immigration has almost been like a political football in a lot of ways. And if you go all the way back to sort of the protectionist era of U.S. workers through the Democratic Party in the 70s, a lot of the comments on protecting U.S. workers and promoting U.S. workers that you hear from the Trump administration were Democratic principles. The Reagan administration is the last time we had a real amnesty. And the use of executive orders to impact immigration really was born out of the Obama administration. So I think sometimes people get a little bit conflated by what's going on politically with what's going on with immigration. But if you look at the Trump administration on the whole, it is really an outlier in terms of how the GOP has handled immigration over the years. It's really something that is almost befuddling because typically speaking, the GOP is all about backing the Commerce Department, about expanding the use of visas. If you look at like our bilateral free trade agreements like NAFTA, or if you look at a trade agreement we have with Australia or the one we have with Singapore and the one we have with Chile, those were all done under Bush the senior and Bush the junior's administrations. The Trump administration is a brand new breed. And a lot of the immigration policy has been created by Stephen Miller, who spent his career prior to joining the White House as an aide, essentially being an anti-immigration advocate. And from almost day one of this administration and going back to the way he campaigned, Trump was operating under the auspice that immigration is bad to the United States. I mean, that became like bar none the benchmark that they were operating from. And every single policy that they created was geared towards reducing the amount of immigration to the United States, whether it be legal or undocumented individuals crossing into the country. And I think the pandemic, in a lot of ways, has amplified this situation. It's provided cover for the government to enact even more far-reaching anti-immigration policies. And we'll get to that in a moment, but make no mistake about it, Edgar. From day one, this administration has been about curtailing immigration. And there's some interesting statistics out there, but Um, including the pandemic period of time, immigration is down 48% overall during the Trump administration from the Obama administration. In the second quarter alone, which obviously was more driven by the pandemic, but immigration decreased by 92%. 92%. And the policies that the administration put in place certainly reflect that. I think what doesn't get talked about a lot, and which is really important for your audience and workers' rights, is there's a secondary cost to the pandemic. And it's something that, you hear about in economic circles. Well, like, is shutting down the economy costing more lives than if you were keeping it going? And I mean, that's a fair debate to be had. I personally think that the U.S. economy can withstand a little bit of a downturn, especially in the name of protecting public health. But there's a fair debate. What is not getting debated and what's not talking about is the workers' rights. What's happening to these people that have been brought here or don't have status? What's happening to the individuals that have come on H-2B visas, H-2A visas? Are they being forced into doing work? Are they forced into labor conditions? We talk about essential support personnel, but how much is actually discussed about the working visa classifications, about the individuals working at the meatpacking facilities, the individuals that are out in the fields? And I think what's most troubling about that, Edgar, is we don't even know the full extent or consequences of what's been happening with those compromised workers whose status is in question in particular. Because not only do you have the pandemic where certain things that go on at home are not being discussed, whether that be abuse or workplace violations, you also have the reality that the Trump administration has disenfranchised individuals from stepping forward and raising complaints for fear of losing their status and being kicked out of the country, that their voice has been further muted. And how does that affect what's going on with workers and then protecting your status? We can have the U visa, which is a protected status for people who are, reporting on criminal activity engaged in by employer. We have the T visa for victims of human trafficking. So there are remedies available, and there's awesome nonprofits out there that are trying to help those people. But if you're too scared to come forward, if you're too afraid to say, here I am and this is what's happening to me, then the abuse will continue. And I think, in all honesty, that's the part that has me most troubled about the current situation. We can deal with the additional hurdles that the Trump administration has put in place when it comes to travel, and we'll talk about that. We can deal with waiting for the Biden administration to take hold to ease visa restrictions and hopefully reset the way we deal with legal immigration to the U.S. We can hope for a Democratic victory in the Georgia runoff, which will set the stage for potentially comprehensive immigration reform, which is long overdue. But what the transition is not going to help with, at least immediately, is a way for these workers who are being abused to have their voices heard. And I don't think there's a mechanism within the law that can really do that, because you're going against a public policy of pushing those people further into the margins. And if they don't trust the government, they don't trust the outcome, and they don't trust the ability for people to help them, then these abuses will continue. And, frankly, it's terrifying. We talk about human trafficking as modern day slavery. And people often think about it as those engaged in the sex trades or people working at facilities abroad, where you have factory workers with unbearable conditions, and it's within the supply chain and it's within the control of U.S. companies to do something about it. But we're very unwilling to admit, Edgar, that this is happening in the United States. And I can honestly tell you that it is prevalent, and we don't know the full extent of it. So, on the whole, I think as far as an overview and as far as your audience is concerned, those are like my main takeaways. But certainly, I'm happy to go into additional detail.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that introduction. And I agree, it's very terrifying. And I guess in terms of a follow-up question, for the workers that you discussed that are in really pretty terrifying predicaments when it comes to their status and speaking up against harsh working conditions. If someone in that class, that demographic came to you and asked for advice, what would you tell them?
Well, I think honestly, if we are approached by an individual, or we work in a lot, we work with a lot of these nonprofits when they need help, and that's part of our firm's pro bono effort. It's honestly a matter of how much evidence and proof we have, and how strong-willed that individual is going to be. Because if you're going to go to the current administration and try to work with immigration and customs enforcement and essentially become like a whistleblower to get future protection, you got to have the evidence so that they can build a case through the U.S. attorneys. And the U.S. attorneys aren't going to take a case unless there's a lot of evidence. And one of the things that we have to be very careful of, Edgar, in all honesty, is taking somebody from a bad situation and making it worse. And there's the law, and there's what the law says, and there's what we can do within the law. And then there's the reality of like what these people's lives are like and how it will be affected. Getting them out of challenging situations and protecting safety of individuals is always first priority. If somebody's life is in danger or they're being threatened, I don't care what the visa situation is, you get out and we deal with it. The problem though, and this is what a lot of people don't like to talk about, Edgar, is that you know how when somebody says, well, I don't have a problem with immigration as long as it's legal immigration. You kind of hear that rhetoric, right? These people shouldn't be entering the country illegally. They should be going through the process. They need to get to the back of the line. Edgar, what people don't realize is there is no line for these individuals. There is no year-round low-skilled visa classification that allows you to be a dishwasher, that allows you to be a home healthcare professional, that allows you to do housekeeping at a hotel. There are seasonal visas for those in agricultural professions or, temporary seasonal work like a ski resort, if you're going to be a lift operator or something like that. But there's no year-round low-skilled visa classification for the United States. Full stop. And this is where I find fault with both administrations, because this has been going on for years and years and years and years. I mean, decades. And both parties have not done a good job of finding a way to protect these individuals for a variety of political reasons that we don't have to delve into today. But we talk about undocumented individuals in this country and people without status. And the question is always like, do we give them amnesty or do we not give them amnesty? Like, obviously, I'm in favor of amnesty if you've been here for a long period of time. But that's only part of it, Edgar. I mean, the reality is we have to look at the underlying situation that has given rise to the undocumented population. We got 11 plus million people in this country without status. 11 million. It's a huge chunk of the population and a huge chunk of the working population. And whether it was done intentionally or on purpose, we have created a subclass of citizenry in the U.S. And that's what needs to be addressed. And honestly, that's one of my big hopes for the Biden administration, is that we finally recognize that these people need status for a number of reasons. One, it will allow them to pay into the healthcare system, because right now people without status are not allowed to get the Affordable Care Act. Two, it will allow us to legally collect a bigger tax base. Three, it will cut down on identity theft, because these individuals won't be forced to use other people's documents to get past I-9 muster. And, that's employment verification. It will also help with Social Security, because a lot of these people are giving other people's Social Security numbers, which messes up benefits and other than that. And most importantly, it will give these people a legal status so that they can hold employers accountable when there is abuse, when there are unfair working conditions, when there are OSHA violations, when there are wage and hour violations, where there are, issues with the Fair Labor Standards Act. We got to recognize that there's two situations going on here. There is the effect, all these people being undocumented, and then there's the cause. Why are they undocumented? 95% of people that enter the country illegally, Edgar, they're coming for economic reasons. They're not coming for some nefarious reasons or family reunification. They're coming because, hey, there's a job here and I can make money and it will better the life of the people that I care about back in my home country. That's the majority of it. They're not going to come unless there's work. And especially as highlighted during a pandemic when unemployment rates are so high, they're not going to become, and U.S. employers aren't going to bring them in if they can get U.S. workers to do it, you would hope, right? But a lot of U.S. workers don't want to do that kind of work. And these employers are desperate for individuals, the good and the well-meaning ones. And that's what's creating the drive for unemployment or, unauthorized entry to the U.S. So, the long about way to your answer is what I kind of gave you. But the short takeaway is like everybody's situation is going to be different. But if you're going to say, hey, I'm brave, I'm strong, I'm stepping forward, these conditions are unfair, you have to have the evidence to prove it. And you have to have, honestly, the mental fortitude to go through the process, because on some level, you're going to have to provide assistance to the government in the persecution of these individuals if you are going to pursue a U visa down the road. And for victims of trafficking, you have to prove that you've been held against your will and you're working that way. So it's tricky. We definitely represent individuals. We've definitely helped liaise with the Immigration and Customs Enforcement on behalf of individuals' cases. But what I like to say is the last thing I want to do is make somebody's situation worse by trying to help make it better.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. And there's been a lot of talk, and we've mentioned a couple of times about visas and the various visas that are available and some of the changes that have been done to the visa system. Can you talk about that in terms of what should people know about today about the visa program?
Yeah, so the Trump administration, and this is kind of another reason why, politically, I find fault. The Obama, let me take you one step back. The Obama administration got really frustrated with trying to work with Congress on comprehensive immigration reform. In fact, they thought they had a bill in 2013 that was going to go through, but it ended up not making it through Congress. And in November of 2014, Obama essentially threw his hands up in the air. And he's like, I can't work with Congress on immigration. Here's a whole bunch of executive orders. And some of them were awesome concepts. The most notable of which was the DACA program, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. Okay. And with the DACA program, it essentially, through executive order, gave status to individuals who were brought here as children. And that's fine. Through the executive branch, they can decide not to prosecute individuals for being here unauthorized. Where it went a step further, and that has really created a lot of the impetus for the current rules that we have, is that they conferred employment authorization on these individuals without going through a congressional statute. That was the problem. So they pretty much just said these people can work. And it's been a great program, 850,000 employment authorizations cards issued. You hear success stories of DACA people all the time. People have gone to law school, become lawyers, professionals, running companies. I mean, the American dream. The problem is, Edgar, when you allow your immigration policy to be dictated through executive order, as opposed to going through Congress, it becomes very fickle. And that's what the Trump administration really globbed onto. They pretty much said the executive branch is now in charge of immigration, not Congress. And really, with the exception of some big stuff that does require statutory adjustments, we can do whatever the heck we want. And that's what's fascinating, because the Trump administration has made very few immigration statutes and regulations. I can probably count them on one hand. But they have passed 400 executive orders impacting immigration. 400 rules coming from the executive branch on how to handle immigration. And the thing about executive orders is, as quickly as you create them, as quickly as you can take them away. Now, the Trump administration tried to do this with DACA, and they met a whole bunch of resistance. And you can see some things worked and some things failed, like the first Muslim ban, the second Muslim ban. They were both rejected by the federal courts. But if you really take a step back and look at it, what they are doing, as one member of the Department of Commerce said to me when I was giving a presentation with him, he said, the Trump administration's immigration policy is a death by 1,000 cuts. It's like they slowly are ebbing away at the policy that's existed. And from an employer perspective, this has been highly problematic because employers crave predictability. And if you have a constantly evolving immigration policy that eliminates predictability, it's harder for them to run their enterprises. And on the worker perspective, now we're talking about legal immigration here, Edgar. You know, if you don't have assurances that your visa status is going to be extended, how much confidence are you going to be in setting up a life here? So, look, they gave us kind of this shock and awe with the first executive order on the Muslim ban. And that one like resonated among the population like nothing I've ever seen. And we did some pro bono work with some Syrian families. It was incredibly rewarding at the time because, yes, it was a terrible policy that frankly like was poorly drafted. And I can get into that if you want. But more so, what I was really impressed by was how many people took offense to it. How people flooded the airports, flooded the streets. There was protests. There was court filings. There was emergency injunctions. Like at a time when this administration constantly pushes against the constitutional bounds of the way the government is run, that was an example of where the rule of law controlled. And frankly, I was worried at the time in January 2017 that we were going to have this big constitutional crisis because if the Trump administration had not listened to the district court, had not amended their policies and enacted the injunction, we could have had a significant breakdown of the way the rule of law operates. So that was a very trying time. The one that's kind of sneaky that a lot of people don't talk a lot about, and frankly, it doesn't fit quite as well on a protest billboard like End the Muslim Ban does, is there was something in April 2017 called Buy American, Hire American. And that really changed the name of the game for visa adjudication because it enacted a new standard. Instead of it just being more of an empirical test of, preponderance of the evidence, more likely than not that somebody deserves a visa classification, it added in a layer where consular officers had to ask themselves whether or not the approval of this particular visa would benefit U.S. workers. It's nowhere in the regulations. It's nowhere in the statutes, but it's something that Trump put in via policy. And that really started to affect adjudication trends. And it ended something called this concept of prior deference, where essentially, like if you've previously been afforded a visa classification, you will be issued it again. So if you're in an H-1B, for example, and somebody files an extension for you, you can almost guarantee that's going to be approved again. This policy kind of ended that. Now, throughout the next 3 years, there's a number of policies, little minor changes here and there that really tweaked confidence in the immigration system. And, we don't really have time today to go into that. But what we saw with the pandemic really became a new level of activity from this administration. So the first thing Trump did, which he takes a lot of credit for, is like blocking Chinese nationals from coming to the United States at the end of January as COVID upticked. I mean, so the U.S. instituted essentially a ban policy saying if you've been in China within the last 14 days, you can't enter the U.S. Right? What they've then done is expand that to the EU, the UK, Brazil, and Iran. Most countries, Edgar, they're doing something where you come into the U.S. and you have to quarantine for 14 days. Or you have to get a testing before you can arrive, like you see in some of the Caribbean islands. We have this very arbitrary ban on which countries can enter freely into the U.S. and which ones can't. So we have this very peculiar situation now where workers who need to come back into the United States either need to get an exemption called a national interest exception, or they got to go to a third country for 14 days before they enter the U.S. So now we have like tons of people going to Mexico and hanging out in Cancun for 14 days before they come back into the U.S. because of this arbitrary rule blocking people from certain countries coming in. But that was just sort of the touchstone, like this very irregular policy that we're seeing. There was two actual regulations. And these were interim final regulations, so meaning that they didn't have to go through the normal rulemaking procedure, and they used the guise of the coronavirus as the mechanism for doing this. But they essentially jacked the wages, raised them by 48% across the board for H-1B workers, arbitrarily with 24 hours notice. And then they've changed the definition of what is a specialty occupation, making it much harder for people to get visas like H-1B, E3, L. They put a ban on getting they put a ban on getting H-1B or L visas until December 31st. They stopped issuing immigrant visas from consulates abroad, whether it be for employment or family reunification. They've forced asylees across the southern border to wait out their asylum applications in Mexico, setting up shanty towns along the border because people can't get their cases processed. And all of these significant anti-immigration related provisions are being done under the guise of COVID-19. The reality is that the virus is problematic enough in and of itself. The virus is dramatically impacting the ability of the globe to function. When you glob on top of it seemingly arbitrary policies that have an ulterior motive, that's where I find fault with what's going on. That's where I see the Trump administration failing people. And, there's a delicate balance here. Obviously, you want to keep the virus at bay. But I have some clients that haven't seen their spouses for 10 months now. Is there a true logic in that exclusion? Is that keeping us any safer, especially when you see the way that the Trump administration feels about the virus in general and the opening of the economy? It's almost like contradictory. And the biggest kicker, Edgar, is, one of the reasons why they said that they're going to institute this policy, and if you take H-1 visas as an example, is because of the high unemployment rates that we're currently experiencing across the U.S. But if you look at the tech sector, which accounts for about 70 to 80% of all H-1B visas issued, the unemployment rate at the beginning of the pandemic was 3%. In June, it went down to 2.8%. It currently sits at 3.5%. I don't see a super huge glut of U.S. workers within that particular field that would warrant restricting the visa classification. So that's part of it. And, prior to the pandemic, one other point that I would like to make is, honestly, all of these policies that are driven at protecting U.S. workers have, in some respects, had an unintentional consequence because companies are now moving their businesses overseas. In particular, Canada has been a tremendous benefit of our anti-immigration policy. As we have further restricted immigration in the U.S., Canada has enhanced it. They've opened up. They've made it much, much, much easier. And you see that reflected in corporate behavior. Microsoft setting up their artificial intelligence facility in Montreal rather than doing it in the U.S. And, my firm has offices in Toronto, and that firm is growing significantly year over because of Trump immigration policies. So, and the thing that kind of shocks me about that is okay, so these workers need to go in near shore, and that's what they call it when they're operating in Canada in the same time zone as their clients from abroad. But, you move all those people up there, it's not creating opportunities for U.S. workers. And in fact, it's lessening opportunities because, as we know, economic modeling suggests for every job that's created in the U.S., it creates 1.8 secondary and tertiary jobs. Well, we're sending those jobs abroad as well. So, I think there's a big disconnect between the messaging that the Trump administration is trying to put out and the reality of what's happening and how it affects people.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. And on top of what you said, you mentioned a couple of visa classes. Can you briefly just describe each one so that people understand what the difference between H-1B, for example, is, and as opposed to an E3 visa?
Yeah, so there's non-immigrant and immigrant visa classifications, Edgar, and you got your primary working ones. H-1B is the most standard of visa classifications. That's what people usually hold after they complete a university degree, and they're coming and joining the workforce in the U.S. The L visa is for intercompany transferees, so that's somebody coming from one company to another. Those are the ones that are, severely been targeted by the Trump administration. H-2B is your seasonal non-agricultural workers. H-2A are your agricultural workers. Those two categories typically have like the highest levels of abuse. So that's your like non-immigrant stream. On the immigrant side, when you say immigrant visa, that really just means green card, permanent residency, the ability to remain in the U.S. without restriction. So, the bottom line is that Stephen Miller is of the impression, and again, philosophically, I think it merits discussion. In reality, I think the answer is clear, but they feel that the more restrictive you have the immigration policies to the U.S., the more opportunities that's going to create for U.S. workers. If we can't have foreign nationals come in, U.S. people are going to hold those jobs. My response to that is, well, one half of all Fortune 100 companies have been created by immigrants or the children of immigrants. If you can't see the value of bringing new knowledge and new talent to the country in order to create jobs for U.S. workers, to expand the economy, to innovate, to be the center of the next generation of technology, whether it be clean energy or supercomputing, if you don't have a mechanism for these people that come to school here and study in these areas and really have the knowledge and the creative drive to be entrepreneurial, we're cutting off future jobs rather than protecting them. But that's essentially what's going on.
Thank you, Jonathan. And another question for you is, now it seems that it's clear that Trump has lost the election and the Biden administration is coming in, but what are your thoughts on the legacy of the Trump administration policy as it relates to immigration and inspection workers? Do you think there will be some lasting effects, positive or I'm guessing meaning negative or otherwise?
Yeah, so we kind of hinted at this, before. I think the Biden administration is going to be a great reset on immigration policy. Make no mistake about it, Biden has not been like historically super friendly to immigrants. He's been in Congress for a long time. He shares a lot of those old school Democrat principles on the role of unions in protecting U.S. jobs. But I think what's going to be a big, big, big difference is the humanitarian approach. We're going to see a lot more care for those seeking asylum, for those who have refugee status. Frankly, to even help these kids that were separated from their parents find their parents. We're talking about 600 kids that are still without their families. I mean, I know it's in the grand scheme of things that might not seem like a huge number of people, but the reality is to have on our watch people being separated from their families does not sound like something the United States should be doing. And I think a lot of those policy stuff that we talked about, Biden is going to be able to rip through those and change those policies pretty quickly. I think this whole thing about asylum south of the border instead of within the United States, that's going to change. I think a lot of the stuff we've seen as far as blocking certain countries, like that Muslim ban from 2017, we'll see that lifted. How quickly they roll back the protocols on the other nationalities traveling in the United States because of COVID, that's yet to be seen. Some of these interim final regulations that we've talked about, depending where they are in the process, we might see a withdrawal of those regulations. The harder thing to change, though, Edgar, is going to be the opinion of the people that are making the decisions. Trump installed a lot of immigration judges, installed a lot of immigration workers, and just like we didn't see an immediate effect from the Trump administration for most of 2017 when it comes to visa adjudication decisions, and now we've seen the effect with huge increases in the amount of requests for evidence and the denials that are issued. I think it's going to conversely take a period of time before we see adjudication trends start to kind of ebb back to the mean. The bigger question is honestly comprehensive immigration reform. I personally think that we need more of a piecemeal approach. We need to attack each issue and get people on board with each individual issue of the system that's broken, so that we can have a separate bill for the DACA kids so that they have a pathway to legal status and ultimately citizenship. I don't believe that should be bundled in with something to expand working visas. They're discrete issues. Historically speaking, everybody has tried to tackle that with one big omnibus bill. And frankly, that's why I think it failed in 2007 and 2013. It's just too much to get done with too many competing interests. But if Biden wants to move the needle at all, that Georgia runoff is going to be very important. The control of the Senate, which then would lead to the control of all three branches of government, are really critical to making new legislation and making meaningful changes. So what happens in Georgia will be impactful. The one thing I would say, though, is, Biden has an interesting role politically, and I'm no political expert, but for somebody who is touted as a moderate Democrat and has had a history of working across the aisle, maybe we still might be able to see something happen. We might still be able to see some reform regardless of what happens in Georgia. In the same respect, within the Democratic Party, there's a pretty significant divide between the centrists and those that are sort of on the socialist democratic side of the spectrum, So it might be hard in some respects to rally meaningful change within the Democratic Party as well. So, I'm a little bit hesitant to say how far the next 4 years are going to go with respect to changing the system, but I am hopeful that regardless of the outcome, we will see some traction on discrete issues and certainly a rollback on a lot of these policies that have been highly problematic. If you look at some of the Biden proposals, some of it's really interesting. Like, I don't think we'll actually go through, but one that was kind of fascinating, Edgar, was the creation of something called a heartland visa, where essentially for the first time, regions and municipalities will be able to dictate how many people they need on visas based on local employment trends. So, for example, if you're out in the Midwest and you need more people on H-2B visas for temporary seasonal work, you'll be able to get those. Or if you need more people on tech visas because you're in Silicon Valley, you'll be able to get those. So I think using technology and economic data to drive some aspects of immigration policy is very creative. And I like that. They're talking about putting in additional protections for workers. I love that. Allowing people to have more control over their visa classification and not necessarily have it tied directly to an employer sponsorship. I think that that's important for worker rights. And hopefully we'll see some change there. The one that I banged on about a little bit, at the beginning of this, about creating a visa classification to deal with the root cause of undocumented workers in the U.S., I don't know if that's possible. And I honestly mean, I don't even know if that's possible if the Democrats win in Georgia. I think we are in for a little bit of a long road there in terms of convincing people as to the significance and importance of creating a legal visa to be able to do a lot of this low-skilled work in the country. I'm hoping for change, but I'm not holding my breath.
Thank you, Jonathan. Are there any attendees on the Zoom call that have any questions for Jonathan? Anything that have a follow-up question on anything he's discussed, or a different question about how immigration is affecting workers' rights?
There's a lot of question marks that remain. And, the intent behind our panel here is just to kind of have, a way for us to make some outreach. And obviously, for those of you that are watching on the recording, nice to meet you. But this is something that is certainly a work in progress. And we'll have to see, where things point. But Edgar, I'd love to get back together with you, maybe after the first 100 days of the Biden administration, and we can really talk about what has changed and what ways we can protect workers and see what's going on with the immigration system and to really make a difference. For today, I think ultimately the takeaway is there's a lot of hope that's returned to the immigration system. There's a lot of things that need to be improved. And one of the greatest weaknesses within the immigration system is our ability to protect those that are marginalized by the system and how to help them so that their voices can be heard. And I hope that that's a huge focus of what this new administration is going to bring to the table. And I hope that faith is somewhat restored in our system so that people who were coming forward before the Trump administration feel empowered to do so again.
I have two questions basically.
Yeah.
And one, they're both a little bit complicated, but the one is is about the question about the 600 plus who families have not been found.
Yes.
And the workaround, whether or not we're going to decide, and this is a biting question, I know. One, finding their family, or are we going to have an issue with adoption for those kids here?
Yeah, so that's a really, really, really tricky issue, Shireen. And honestly, the previous system was not great, because what would end up happening beforehand and what still kind of happens is like these kids are released to people that are claimed to be relatives or have some known knowledge of the child. And that's actually led to a lot of human trafficking in the past. There's no great solution here other than to say, hey, we won't separate families, which is a pretty easy one to kind of get your head around from a policy moving forward. But fixing these situations, finding these families, putting the resources there so there can be reunification, it is going to be a tremendous lift. And I hate to say it, but in some instances, those families don't want to be identified. And that's also a scary part about it. It's just the perception on what's going on in their home country, the fear of like, can they raise families there? There's true economic, political, and social strife in a lot of these places where they're trying to give their children a better life. And I know it's going to sound so foreign, but to some people in those situations, abandoning your children at the border is a better life than you could provide for them yourself. And that's a tricky thing. And that's also an obligation that the United States needs to take in earnest. So I don't have an easy answer for that one. The policy through all administrations has been terrible on children at the border. But what this administration did in separating the families to try to act as a deterrent from future people coming to the U.S. was just heinous.
A little bit of a follow-up to that one. I guess my question then is, because I feel the same way, that this has always been a policy issue, and it didn't matter which administration, because even the Biden and Obama administration participated in deportation as well.
Yeah, in fact, so there's Obama was known as Obama was used to be referred to as the deporter in chief by immigration advocacy groups. I mean, he did some good things on deferred action, but he also deported more people than any other administration prior to him. So,
and that's my question about Biden coming in. I mean, he was a part of that administration. Is that something he's gonna? That's one of the big questions I have about whether or not he's going to change that. I mean, the easy fix is to stop ripping kids away, but the deportation question is in my mind, still lingering.
Well, I think where the Obama administration got it right is they were going after people with like heavy criminal records, multiple entries without inspection, and then they would give deferred action to people that were like otherwise good citizens who just happened to enter the country illegally. You do have Mayorkas coming in as the Secretary of Department of Homeland Security, who was acting director before. He was within that administration, and his appointment has been applauded by immigrant rights groups. And there is some hope that he will change the policy around. There's been a number of pleas for people saying, like, do not go back to the Obama policies, recognizing that they were highly problematic. And this is where I would say, like, I made this comment, like, Biden has not always been the greatest on immigration. These are where a lot of these concerns are fostered. Do I think it's going to be better? Yes. But Shireen, again, like, until we have a low-skilled visa classification that is easy to obtain, where we can say to people, yo, if you're here illegally, go back to the embassy. We'll give you an amnesty on applying for the right kind of visa, and you can come back. You don't even need to give them an amnesty to stay in the country. Until we do something like that, this is going to continue to be an issue. And, I have some ideas on ways that we can satisfy union concerns along these regards. And there's ways you can build up a law and a policy that will do it the right way. But you're 100% right. Like, no amount of policy is going to fix this situation. It has to come from an act of Congress, recognizing that we have not been handling the low skilled worker question correctly for decades. And that takes ownership, and it frankly it takes an apology. Which sounds odd, but I think to get people behind it, you got to say, look, we've been doing this the wrong way. And Shireen, this is one of those things where I feel like history is going to look back on this era in terms of the way we've handled immigration, and we're going to be ashamed of it. We're going to be ashamed of the way that we treated our fellow man. We're going to be ashamed of the fact that we created this class of people without status almost intentionally, or at least willfully, blindly, that has not only affected their ability to be part of society, but also protect their rights as workers. So it's probably the hardest question to unpack. And it has a relatively simple solution in theory, but executing it is going to be a Herculean effort.
Any other questions from the audience? Thank you, Shereen, for your contribution. All right, if there are no other questions, Jonathan, thank you so much for your time and for giving us the skinny on what has happened in the past and what to hope for in the future when it comes to immigration. I want to highlight the fact that Workplace Fairness does have pages on the intersection of immigration and employment law, and Jonathan's firm has been gracious enough to help us enhance what we currently have. So expect some more updates to those pages in the next couple of weeks and hopefully months as we have a new administration coming in. So thank you all for tuning in, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Take care, everyone.
Hi, everybody.